Director at the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. And I've got a professional blurb, which if you'll excuse me, I'm going to read out. I'm not going to even try to attempt to depart from. Before returning to biography full-time in 2005, Grant served as an art and music critic for newspapers and magazines in the US and Canada. He's a prolific writer. His first book, A Life of Stage and Screen Comedian Charlotte Greenwood, was published in 2007 by McFarlane and Company. His second, the first biography of Chinese-American author and personality Princess Derling, was published by Hong Kong University Press in 2008. It continues. His biography of actress and Wizard of Oz icon Billie Burke was published in spring 2009. His latest book, The Empress and Mrs. Conger, deals with the extraordinary friendship of American diplomatic wife Sarah Pike Conger and the Empress Dowager Cixi of China, before, during, and after one of the greatest cataclysms of the East-West relations, of course, the 1900 Boxer Uprising. He's now working on his next book, about to be published, the biography of Pauline Benton, the American-born master of Chinese shadow theater, who studied with the last living masters from the imperial period in the 1930s Beijing. And it's being sent to McGill Queen's University Press. So that's about to be published. And his recent project, exhausting, Grant is now working on the first biography of Lillian Carter, mother of President Jimmy Carter, in cooperation with the Carter family. So, without further ado, Grant, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, everyone. Can you see Mrs. Conger here? Yes, thank you, Helen, for making this possible. This is quite wonderful. I don't know if any of you were planning to come to the earlier talk in January, wasn't it, when we had our snowstorm? But I know one person who made it that day, and I think I will congratulate her afterward. See her about that. Just thank you for coming to hear about this wonderful friendship. The extraordinary Sarah Pike Conger, far more extraordinary than she looked. If a picture really does speak 1,000 words, for Sarah Conger, it could do more than that. It could capture not just the image, but the living soul of its subject, delivering to the viewer a truth of the subject's personality that words could never convey. In fact, it was distorted words Sarah hoped to combat: the character assassination of the Empress Dowager Cixi of China, when she convinced the Dowager to allow a foreign artist to paint her portrait in 1904. The wife of Edwin Hurd Conger, the U.S. minister to China, Sarah came to Beijing in 1898, a middle-aged lady from Iowa, knowing nothing of the people or their culture. Yet she left 7 years later, one of China's most sympathetic defenders. As survivor of the Boxer Uprising, that mob effort to rid China of foreign influence, Sarah stretched out a hand to the one person who bore the most blame for the disaster, the Empress Dowager Cixi. And Cixi, who had no reason to love any foreigner, put her hand in Sarah's. There you go. Don't want to stand in her way. The daughter of a Manchu official, Cixi was born in 1835 and was selected as concubine to the Shenfeng Emperor at 16. Bearing the emperor's only son, Cixi rose in rank after Shenfeng's death in 1861, becoming Empress Dowager when their son, the Tongzhi Emperor, ascended the throne. She served as regent to him and after his early death for her nephew, the Guangxu Emperor. Her bad press in the West began in 1898 when, during Guangxu's 100 Days of Reform, she discovered that his platform included plans to depose her. So she acknowledged that China needed reform, but not at such breakneck speed and certainly not at her expense. She placed the emperor under house arrest and captured some, but not all of his advisors. One of these, Kang Youwei, escaped and from exile filled newspaper columns with fulminations against Cixi, charging her with every sin of depravity and misrule, including the murder of her own son. And of course, Cixi's alleged connivance in the Boxer Uprising in summer 1900, and this is from around that time, put the final nail in her public relations coffin. After Cixi's return from exile in January 1902, when Sarah and other diplomatic wives came to the Forbidden City at her invitation, the uprising was still fresh in the minds of their husbands, who saw Cixi and the Chinese as backward xenophobes, willing to commit mass murder. These women, encouraged by Sarah, accepted Cixi's invitation and opened themselves to international criticism. Their bravery was great, but Sarah's was greater. Unlike these women, Sarah had lived through the bullets and bombs while filling sandbags and burying the dead. It was easy to blame Cixi for fomenting the uprising, but the truth of her involvement is far more complicated than is realized. Something Sarah seems to have appreciated to an extraordinary degree for the times. "My sympathy is with China," she wrote, at a time when such a sentiment was tantamount to treason. Not only did Sarah believe that the West had brought on itself the anger which powered the uprising, she also believed it was more useful to build bridges between East and West by sitting down to face to face with one's enemy, than to endure a prolonged standoff ringed around with the pickets of protocol. She spoke of her reasons to another American, Bailey Willis, a young engineer in Beijing. Sarah told him she had been unable to resist when Cixi had made such a sincere and humble effort. When the door opened a little way, she told him, "I had either to close it or to go in and see where it might lead. It is not for me to say what the influence might be. But if you could meet her," she said of the Empress Dowager, "and she should take your hand and look in your eye and speak to you as she has to me, you would think her sincere." Sarah felt that pressing the thorns of sorrow and revenge deeper into our hearts will never lessen the sting of the horrible past, nor permit us to rest in peace. Through that half-open door lay Sarah's boldest idea, to commission the first Western-style portrait of the Dowager. First Western-style portrait of the Empress Dowager that would offer the world an image of Cixi as she knew her to be, not as illustrated papers and biased journalists depicted her. This was precedent-shattering enough, as in China, portraits were only painted of people after they had died. In addition, the picture would be executed by a woman, the American artist Catherine Augusta Carl. No foreigner had ever had such access to the imperial presence before. Cixi had first posed for formal and informal photographic portraits in 1903, when Shunling, a brother of her lady-in-waiting, Princess Derling, began taking photos of her at the Summer Palace and at her Beijing retreat near the Forbidden City. For all that they are posed, some of them in costume settings with Cixi in the role of Guan Yin, Goddess of Mercy, and some of them with various references to operas that she loved. These images are intensely revealing, particularly those that show her more or less as her real self. Wandering her snowy gardens or gazing at her aging face in a hand mirror, they pierce the obscuring veil of Cixi's godlike reign to show a woman of sensitivity and sadness, but also determination and fortitude. And as actual representations of the woman, they are effective vehicles for bringing this most private and yet talked about imperial woman to the general public. What Sarah didn't realize is that one photograph taken by Shunling, which didn't appear until many years later, would tell volumes not just about Cixi's humanity, but about Sarah's own fierce compassion for the Dowager and for the troubled nation that it was her fate to rule more than Catherine Carl's painted portrait ever could do. And this is that picture. This is Sarah, and this is the Empress Dowager. This is a niece of Derling. thing to notice here is that they are holding hands, which is the only photo ever taken of the Empress Dowager touching a foreigner in any way. Ironically, Shunling's photograph was developed in obscurity after the portrait was sent as ambassador to America, with flags flying and a dragon-robed imperial escort. Fated at the 1904 St. Louis exposition, Carl's portrait was later presented to President Theodore Roosevelt, while Shunling's negative was filed away, likely never seen by any of those pictured in it. During the 1930s, it and the other negatives showing the Empress Dowager were almost destroyed and were passed from hand to hand, surviving Civil War China and the indiscriminate selling off of the estate of Princess Derling, into whose keeping they had fallen, until they came to rest in the Smithsonian Institution. They have only now emerged from that darkness to renewed interest in 21st century America in an exhibit that ran this past fall. Some have asked me, was this a true friendship? If some of Cixi's gestures to other foreigners appear token, there is an authenticity and spontaneity about her actions towards Sarah that to me appear genuine. They often sat side by side in the Dowager's bedroom, comparing cultures and exchanging gifts, and Cixi showed many kindnesses to Sarah's family in America. The Dowager even paid Sarah the compliment of taking her advice, issuing a decree to permit foreign education of promising Chinese and Manchu boys, after Sarah spoke to her on the topic. And she supported Sarah's suggestion that the Dowager found schools for women in China. When the portrait was finally unveiled, Sarah believed it supplied the missing key to the mystery of who the Dowager was. As she wrote, true to the Chinese idea, there were characters, symbols, seals, and decorations. All spoke a silent but positive language. But that which was far more to me was the imperial woman sitting there in her strength of character. As I gazed at the portrait, I could recall a sweet tone of voice, a gentle clasp of hand, a cordial smile. There is a chord in human nature when played upon by woman that woman alone can hear and appreciate. So now allow me to read from the book about how the portrait project came about and how it led to this long unseen photograph taken one hot summer's day in 1904 with its hand clasp that made history. For the start date of the portrait, Cixi had chosen August 5th after consulting with her court astrologers. She evidently also chose the hour, 11 o'clock, on the same basis. It was the hour of the horse, a favorable sign in the Chinese zodiac for profitable undertakings, but one which perhaps should have given the artist Catherine Carl pause, since the horse is not known to like being tied to any one place. The day was a bright one, Sarah recalled, and Kate concurred. The distant hills, where lay the summer palace, were delicately limned against a soft blue-gray sky, she wrote, and the whole made an entrancing picture. Sarah and Kate were received at the palace entrance by Chief Eunuch Li Lianming and escorted to the Hall of Benevolence and Longevity, Cixi's officials' audience hall, with its bronze lions snarling at malefic spirits and giddy American visitors. Kate, too, had heard all the stories about the Empress Dowager and was shocked to see, quote, a charming little lady with a brilliant smile who stepped forward to greet Sarah. Kate was so overcome, she made a gesture of homage, a breach of custom unthinkable to any Chinese, which would characterize her adoring relationship with Cixi over the next 9 months. She took the hand the Empress Dowager extended in greeting and kissed it. Cixi did not seem to mind. Her Majesty's first impression of Miss Carl was a good one, Cixi's lady-in-waiting Derling recorded. Cixi was to affirm this when later she affably assided to Derling, we will handle her pretty easily, I think. Cixi ordered eunuchs to fetch Kate's painting materials into the hall, including the 6-by-4-foot canvas she had brought from Beijing. Derling had advised Kate that Cixi would not sit for anything smaller, and noted with exasperation that when Cixi saw the canvas, she was, quote, very much disappointed, as in her opinion, even that was not large enough. The Officials from the Foreign Office told Kate that Cixi would not be able to pose more than twice for her, a schedule that would have given her hardly enough time for a preliminary sketch. She would stretch this restriction a bit, but that was the least of her worries this first day, in the unprepossessing darkness of the audience hall, which she studied frantically for a properly lit vantage point in which to begin her work. Cixi, who had left the room, now re-emerged wearing a yellow silk gauze embroidered with fat purple wisteria, to be immortalized in one of the 2 official portraits Kate painted. Kate's eye for detail, trained in the richly observant school of French painting and now feasting on the visual smorgasbord before her, gives some idea of her plans for the portrait. As she wrote, "At the top button from the right shoulder hung a string of 18 enormous pearls separated by flat pieces of brilliant transparent green jade. From the same button was suspended a large carved pale ruby which had yellow silk tassels terminating in 2 immense pear-shaped pearls of great beauty," and on and on and on. It was a good thing she rejoiced in this splendid minutiae. She would need to fill up the huge canvas with it. After the eunuchs had placed the dragon-carved throne in the one place that gave Kate some light to work in, Cixi took her seat, and promptly at 11 o'clock, as announced by the chimes and tunes of 85 different clocks distributed about the room, the project began. Beginning anything is momentous, Kate recalled, but aside from having a wall of blank canvas before her on one side and the Empress Dowager of China on the other, Kate was herself the object of attention of several rows of princesses, ladies-in-waiting, eunuchs, and servant girls, all standing, quote, "in breathless silence around, intently watching every movement, for everything touching Her Majesty is a solemnity." Sarah, standing in the crowd, was watching too, but it was Cixi whom she studied. While Her Majesty was posing for her portrait, she recalled, 2 eunuchs knelt before her with communications. Her Majesty took one and perused it, then took the other. The intensity of her expression while reading spoke volumes, although it also said much about her inability to hold a pose, while Kate sketched rapidly in charcoal. Before Kate had done much more than block in the figure in the head, Cixi turned abruptly to her interpreter and said, "Enough work had been done for the day." As the clocks ticked, Cixi came down from her throne in a rustle of silk gauze to inspect Kate's work. Politely, since Cixi had given her no more than about 15 minutes of her time, Kate recalled that the Dowager's personality was so strong that she had been able to get enough of her character into this rough sketch to make it a sort of likeness. As Sarah affirmed, the likeness pleased all. After luncheon, an opera performance which Cixi narrated to her guests through Derling, and the giving of gifts, Sarah departed the palace wearing scented sandalwood bracelets Cixi had placed on her wrists. Even as Kate, delighted beyond measure by the success of the venture and the unexpected charm of Cixi, quote, had a curious feeling of having been transported into a strange world, Sarah went home with a similar sense of wonder, but also a gratitude that at last the portrait project was begun. "The magnitude of this portrait painting is beginning to grow on me," Sarah told her daughter Laura. "What will the end be?" Kate might have asked the same. Over the next several months, there would be many starts and stops as Kate tried to keep up a regular schedule of sittings in a variety of settings, from the summer palace to the Forbidden City, none of them perfect for lighting or convenience. She would have to resign herself to having Derling and her sister stand in for the Dowager when Cixi decided she could not pose any longer. What happened to Kate Carl, however, was much the same process as that which was transforming Sarah into an admirer and a defender of China and the Chinese. As Kate was trying on the court gowns Cixi had made for her, learning to use chopsticks in the Chinese language, exposing herself to the music, theater, and ceremonials of Cixi's court, and studying the elderly woman she had come to paint and came away adoring, Sarah was moving forward with her own larger project. It was an adjunct to the portrait project, of building as many bridges between her world and that of Chinese women as she could and as they would allow. This meant facing stereotypes head on. As Sarah told an American friend, "At first, as we look at Chinese culture, we see nothing but confusion. We see no method, and everything seems to be done backwards. We see customs without meaning, education without value, religion without a redeeming feature. We are amused at the people, at their style of clothes, of wearing their hair, at their modes of locomotion, their process of tilling the soil, their ancestor worship, their attitude toward women. We ridicule their amusements and doubt their sincerity in all things. In fact, we deride, belittle, and woefully underrate everything Chinese. But if we can detect their line of thought, we can better comprehend their actions. It may be that we shall learn lessons of value to our own living. Cixi had decreed, per her court astrologers, that the portrait for the exposition, which this is, had to be completed by April 19th, 1904. Though she avoided the portrait up to now, as the deadline drew near, she could not keep away from it. She spent a great deal of time in my pavilion watching its progress, Kate recalled, and expressed herself much delighted with it. Unlike the portrait Kate had started with, showing Cixi more than life-sized in her yellow gauze gown, the St. Louis image demonstrated what Kate had learned, not just about Chinese art, but about the Dowager herself. If Cixi's figure dominated the first portrait, the second one placed her as the central feature in a grand mosaic, the sum total of which was the Jing throne. Gowned in yellow silk patterned with narcissus and double long life characters, Cixi wears her cape of 3,000 pearls, each the size of a small bird's egg, and nacris webwork draped across her shoulders like the net of Indra, a Buddhist concept of the interconnectedness of the universe. Unlike the first portrait, where Cixi is shown slightly turned from the viewer, the St. Louis portrait displays her face on and shadowless, a screen behind her alive with a flock of phoenix birds in flight, the phoenix being the symbol of the Chinese empress. Cixi invited the ladies of the foreign legations out to the summer palace to view the finished portrait on April 19th. The admiration received from the young empress and the ladies of the court was almost embarrassing, Kate thought. Indeed, eunuchs always bowed whenever they saw this portrait through the windows of Kate's studio. When the imperial princes and officials came to see the portrait, it had to be moved out of the area reserved for women to the courtyard in front of Kate's pavilion. Yet even Kate could not be present, having to content herself with listening to what comments she could understand from behind curtains. Even so, there would not have been much to hear from these inscrutable officials. I must confess they revealed very little, Kate recalled. Probably afraid to say the wrong thing, they opted to say nothing. The portrait was now packed up in a camphor-wood box, lined and covered with imperial yellow satin, and sent on its long voyage to the United States, kept upright the entire way to avoid placing it in the recumbent position of the dead. The train left Beijing bearing the sacred picture, as it was called, in a crate wrapped in silk covered in huge five-clawed dragons, seen off by a large delegation. On reaching San Francisco, the portrait was placed on another train for St. Louis, where on June 19th it was opened in the presence of several American dignitaries. The proposed health of Her Majesty and the prosperity of China, Kate was told. They proposed the health of Her Majesty and the prosperity of China, which the assistants drank in sparkling champagne. Then the sacred picture was put on display. The portrait was actually a bit of a hit at the exposition, if only for its exotic camphor-wood frame, which had been designed by the Empress Dowager, and the fact that it was exhibited alongside the pedantic portraiture of Julius Garibaldi Melchers and other turn-of-the-century American artists. The New York Times, buying into the prevailing attitude that everything in China was out of proportion to reality, published a wry editorial about the portrait, which claimed it was, with frame, 14 feet tall, but that this ungainly gift horse must not be looked in the mouth, comparing Cixi to, quote, a choice palfrey, stiff with jeweled and embroidered housings and radiant in all devices of ornament. A year later, a reviewer of Kate's memoirs of her several months at the imperial court would opine in the pages of the New York Times that she did not know how to paint at all, though this was more about her over-enthusiastic literary portrait than the one she created on canvas. Yet, truth told, Kate had been forced by Cixi's demands into producing something far closer to propaganda art than portraiture. Following the exposition, Chinese Minister Sir Chen Tongliangcheng represented the portrait on Cixi's behalf to President Theodore Roosevelt in the White House Blue Room. It was only fitting, said the ambassador, that the portrait of Her Majesty should become the property of the United States government as a memorial of her abiding interest in the welfare and prosperity of the American people. Before Cixi's portrait had been packed for shipping, it was photographed by Shunling, the elder brother of Derling, a courtier who looked after the electrical plant at the Summer Palace. Shunling was trained in European photographic techniques. It was he who took the first photographs of the Empress Dowager in her court from 1903 to 1905. With its quicker turnaround time and its negligible demands on its subject's time, photography appealed more to Cixi than having her portrait painted. Long before she was being photographed around the Summer Palace grounds in a variety of poses, settings, and costumes, notably as Guanyin, she was often handling the cameras herself and watching with interest how Shunling developed the prints. Sometime later that summer, after the fateful revealing of the St. Louis portrait, Derling's brother set up his bulky camera in a courtyard of the Summer Palace and directed the servants to stretch between the pillars a painted canvas backdrop of bamboo and birds. A throne chair for Cixi was placed on a rich carpet laid over the paving stones. In this setting, Shunling photographed Cixi with Sarah, 3 other foreign women, and his own young daughter, Lili. A few commentators who have seen this picture, who are not familiar with prints of the original negative, and have only small or poorly reproduced examples to judge by, have read into Cixi's expression impatience or arrogance, annoyance or boredom as she sits on her throne, her left hand clasped in Sarah's right. Though the most striking feature of the photograph is certainly the fact that Cixi is touching a foreigner at all, her expression does not support a negative interpretation. In the meantime, Sarah gazes into the lens with a boldly direct stare, her lips set in a smile both wise and challenging, as if to say to those who believed her a fool to love the Chinese and their Empress Dowager, "They are my friends, and could be yours too, if you would only stop to look at them."